Cherries seem to play a part in President George Washington's legacy, and the newest discovery at his former home, archaeologists uncovered glass bottles filled with cherries and fruits.
Finding what is essentially fresh fruit 250 years later is pretty spectacular.
For over 160 years, archaeologists thought they knew everything about Mount Vernon. Every brick examined, every cellar mapped, every artifact catalogued. The estate of America's first president had given up all its secrets, or so everyone believed. Then, in April 2024, during routine foundation repair, workers removed a section of basement flooring and discovered something that made veteran archaeologists question everything: a hidden chamber, sealed before the American Revolution, missing from every historical record. Inside that forgotten room sat 35 glass bottles untouched for over 250 years. But what shocked scientists wasn't the bottles, it was what they found inside them, perfectly preserved in ways that should be impossible. And here's what makes this discovery even more incredible. The skilled hands that created this miracle were never given credit. Their names were erased from history. This find is finally bringing their extraordinary story into the light. Mount Vernon sits on a hill overlooking the Potomac River, more than just a museum. It's a testament to one of the most successful preservation efforts in American history. When George Washington died in 1799, his beloved home started crumbling. The family couldn't afford maintenance. His heirs struggled to keep up. The massive estate paint peeled from the wooden exterior. Floorboards rotted through, windows cracked and weren't replaced. By the 1850s, the situation was desperate. Tourists arrived by steamboat, eager to see where the first president lived. But instead of respecting the site, they chipped pieces off walls as souvenirs. They carved their initials into door frames. They pried loose bricks from the foundation. The roof was caving in. The famous cupola that Washington himself designed was close to collapse. The estate was literally being destroyed by neglect and tourism combined. That's when Anne Pamela Cunningham did something revolutionary. After seeing Mount Vernon's terrible condition during a boat trip in 1853, she wrote a passionate public letter urging American women to save Washington's home. Her call to action worked. In 1858, she formed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, an all-women's group that raised money through small donations from across the country. At a time when women couldn't vote, couldn't own property in many states, and had virtually no political power, they accomplished something extraordinary. They raised enough funds to purchase the entire 200-acre estate. They became the first private citizens group in U.S. history to preserve a landmark. It was groundbreaking, revolutionary even. They didn't just save it, they studied it obsessively. For 166 years, generation after generation of preservationists examined every inch. Professional archaeologists arrived in the early 1900s, bringing scientific methodology to historic preservation. By the 1950s, they used cutting-edge technology. Ground-penetrating radar mapped what lay beneath the surface. Carbon dating established precise timelines. Soil analysis revealed construction techniques. Teams excavated carefully, using brushes and small tools to preserve delicate artifacts. They found servant quarters, wine cellars, storage rooms, thousands upon thousands of artifacts, pottery fragments that revealed dining habits, tools that showed construction methods, building materials that demonstrated architectural evolution. Every single discovery was photographed from multiple angles, measured precisely, catalogued in detailed databases, and analyzed by specialists. By 2024, Mount Vernon had become one of the most thoroughly documented historic sites on the planet. Universities used it as the gold standard case study for historic preservation. Archaeological teams published hundreds of research papers based on findings from the estate. Graduate students wrote dissertations about its architecture, agriculture, and social structure. The consensus among every expert was unanimous. Nothing significant remained to find. They'd mapped every underground structure using the latest technology, excavated every promising location identified by surveys, analyzed soil composition across the entire property down to chemical levels. Mount Vernon had been studied so completely, so exhaustively, that new archaeological work seemed almost pointless. What else could possibly be discovered? Then, the mansion revitalization project started. The $40 million effort was supposed to be routine maintenance, standard preservation work. Engineers discovered the foundation was weakening after centuries of supporting the massive structure. Brick and mortar naturally degrade over time. To fix the problem properly, they needed to access areas beneath the basement floor that had been undisturbed for generations. The archaeological team expected nothing exciting, maybe some construction debris from the 1700s, perhaps broken pottery that previous excavations had missed, standard stuff that wouldn't change any historical understanding or make headlines. They prepared for boring, routine documentation work. Another day at the office. What they found instead would rewrite Mount Vernon's story and shock the archaeological world. The work crew was carefully removing basement floor sections when someone noticed an irregularity. The soil seemed different, more compacted. The brick pattern didn't match surrounding areas. Traces of mortar seemed out of place. Old buildings have weird construction quirks all the time, so nobody panicked. But as they widened the excavation, they uncovered an opening, a space extending beneath the mansion in a direction that shouldn't have any underground structures, according to every map, blueprint, and archaeological survey ever conducted. The project supervisor called in Mount Vernon's archaeology team immediately. Within hours, specialists arrived with documentation equipment. They set up lighting, stabilized the opening, and prepared to enter a space untouched for over 2 centuries. The first archaeologist to shine a flashlight into the chamber stopped breathing. The space was roughly 12 feet across, with carefully constructed stone walls. The ceiling was low, maybe 6 feet high. The floor was packed earth undisturbed since it was sealed, and along one wall, arranged with almost ceremonial precision, were dozens of glass bottles standing upright. Not broken fragments scattered in dirt. Whole bottles, sealed bottles, bottles clearly containing something inside. Finding intact 18th century glass was rare, but not unprecedented. What made their hands shake was what they could see through that old, bubbled glass. Dark liquid, shadows of organic material, things that absolutely should not have survived 250 years underground. They forced themselves to slow down despite the adrenaline. One wrong move could destroy evidence that had survived since before America existed as a country. The documentation process took 3 full days. They photographed every bottle from multiple angles, measured exact positions, analyzed the sand storage material, documented brickwork and mortar composition, created detailed construction maps. The bottles themselves were works of art, hand-blown with imperfections and air bubbles reflecting early glass-making techniques, some tall and slender with elongated necks, others short and round with wide bodies, each slightly different, suggesting different makers or time periods. Of the 35 bottles counted, 29 were perfectly intact. 6 had cracked over centuries, their contents evaporated or absorbed into surrounding earth. But those 29 intact bottles were about to reveal something extraordinary. Analysis of the chamber's construction revealed something puzzling. The brickwork dated to around the 1750s, before George Washington's major renovations. This space had been part of the estate's earliest structure. But here's the strange part. The chamber had been deliberately sealed sometime in the early 1800s. Someone bricked it over, buried it beneath the mansion floor, and then apparently forgot it existed. Why seal a storage chamber and erase it from all records? Washington family papers mentioned wine cellars and root cellars, but this specific chamber appeared in 0 historical documents. It was as if someone had intentionally deleted it from the estate's memory. The mystery deepened when they transported those bottles to the lab. When scientists began examining the sealed bottles in a controlled laboratory, they approached the work with extreme caution, mixed with barely contained excitement. These weren't just old bottles. They were potential time capsules containing actual organic material from the 1750s. The initial analysis results made several scientists literally gasp. 12 bottles contained cherries. 16 held what appeared to be berries, most likely gooseberries or currants. 1 bottle contained a mixture of both. But calling them contained doesn't capture what scientists were actually seeing. The fruits were whole, intact. Individual cherry pits still had visible stems attached, trimmed to precise lengths. Berry skins showed structural detail that normally breaks down within years. Under powerful magnification, botanists identified cellular structures that had somehow remained preserved. One scientist examining a cherry pit kept muttering, "This shouldn't be possible. This absolutely shouldn't be possible." Some bottles still had fragments of original sealing materials. Cork pieces showed impressions where 18th century wax had been pressed to create airtight seals. Bits of cloth revealed how workers had wrapped bottlenecks before applying final seals. Every detail told a story about extraordinary skill. Chemical analysis revealed why preservation worked so spectacularly well. The fruits had been prepared in a precisely calibrated mixture of alcohol, sugar, and various spices, including cinnamon. The alcohol percentage was high enough to prevent bacterial and fungal growth, but not so high it would break down fruit tissue. The sugar created additional osmotic pressure that inhibited microbial activity. The spices added antimicrobial properties. This wasn't luck. This was science being practiced before underlying principles were formally understood. Whoever prepared these fruits understood fermentation chemistry, preservation ratios, storage techniques, and sealing methods at a level that would genuinely impress modern food scientists. They'd calculated precise ratios, monitored fermentation processes, and created storage conditions that would last centuries. The implications hit the research team immediately. The USDA Agricultural Research Service sent their top specialists to examine the bottles. DNA testing began on cherry pits and berry seeds. The goal was ambitious: identify exact fruit varieties that existed in the 18th century Virginia but might no longer exist anywhere today. Modern agriculture has completely transformed fruit varieties over 250 years. Breeding programs optimized for shipping durability, shelf life, uniform appearance, and pest resistance. Flavor and nutritional content became secondary concerns. Many heirloom varieties simply disappeared. But these bottles potentially held genetic material from those lost strains. Some seeds underwent germination testing. Could 250-year-old cherry seeds actually sprout? The idea seemed impossible, but archaeological precedent suggested it might work. Seeds from ancient Egyptian tombs have successfully germinated after thousands of years. Imagine orchards growing cherries that haven't existed since George Washington was alive. Fruit with flavors nobody in 250 years has tasted. Now here's where this connects to America's most famous fictional story. Everyone knows the tale of young George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and admitting guilt because he could not tell a lie. It's taught in schools as a lesson about honesty. Except it never happened. Mason Locke Weems, Washington's biographer, invented the entire story to sell more books. He later admitted he made it up to create morality tales for children. There's zero historical evidence the cherry tree incident occurred. But these cherries, these are real, and they connect to a story far more important than any made-up fable. When major news outlets first reported the Mount Vernon discovery, headlines focused almost exclusively on George Washington. Articles described it as a window into the first president's world, his dining preferences, his household management. That framing completely missed the actual story. George Washington didn't preserve these fruits. He almost certainly never touched most of these bottles during preparation. The knowledge, skill, and precision required to create what scientists found came from entirely different hands. Hands belonging to people history tried very hard to forget. Mount Vernon in the 18th century was home to over 300 enslaved people. They worked from sunrise to sunset in fields. They built structures. They maintained equipment. They processed all food. They operated kitchens that fed not just the Washington family, but constant streams of high-ranking guests. Think about what creating these preserved fruits actually required. First, someone needed extensive agricultural knowledge to know exactly when cherries and berries reached optimal ripeness for preservation. Too early, and they wouldn't have enough sugar content for proper fermentation. Too late, and they'd start fermenting unpredictably. The timing had to be absolutely perfect. Then came meticulous preparation. Every cherry needed its stem trimmed to a specific length for both practical and aesthetic reasons. Every berry required inspection for damage or disease because one contaminated fruit could ruin an entire batch. The preservation mixture demanded precise chemistry. The alcohol-to-sugar ratio had to create the right balance between preservation and palatability. Too much alcohol would break down fruit tissue. Too little wouldn't prevent bacterial growth. The concentration needed to create osmotic pressure that would inhibit microbes without crystallizing. Fermentation required constant monitoring. Temperature fluctuations could ruin everything. Timing was absolutely critical. The final sealing had to create a completely airtight environment using only materials available in the 1750s, which meant combining cork, wax, and cloth in exactly the right proportions and techniques. This was advanced food science being practiced generations before scientists formally understood the principles. The workers in Mount Vernon's kitchens possessed knowledge that blended African, European, and indigenous preservation traditions into something entirely innovative. They were literally creating what we now call American cuisine, combining techniques from 3 continents into methods that would influence cooking for centuries. Historical records reference Martha Washington's head cook, though documents usually identify her only with the name Doll. She arrived at Mount Vernon in 1759, when Martha married George Washington. For decades afterward, she managed an incredibly complex kitchen operation. The Washington household regularly hosted foreign ambassadors, political leaders, military commanders, and international dignitaries. The meals served at Mount Vernon became famous throughout Virginia and beyond. Martha Washington's legendary hospitality depended entirely on the expertise of kitchen workers who created elaborate multi-course dinners using seasonal ingredients. The preserved fruits likely served multiple culinary purposes. Some probably went into desserts during winter months when fresh fruit was unavailable. Historical records confirm the Washingtons loved ice cream, so some might have been served as toppings. Others could have been incorporated into sauces or preserves that accompanied various dishes. But the people who created this culinary and scientific achievement, who possessed knowledge and skills that would impress modern experts, were systematically erased from the historical record. Their contributions became footnotes in estate inventories. Their expertise was taken completely for granted, treated as background labor rather than specialized craftsmanship. Their names, with rare exceptions, were lost entirely. Recent archaeological work at Mount Vernon has tried recovering these lost stories. Excavations near slave quarters have uncovered personal items, handmade objects, cooking implements, and artifacts that reveal efforts to maintain cultural identity under brutal oppression. These objects show people making choices about their possessions, creating art from whatever materials they could access, preserving traditions despite enormous pressure to erase them. The bottles discovered in 2024 added crucial new dimensions to this story. They demonstrated not just survival, but extraordinary expertise. They proved that workers in Mount Vernon's kitchens possessed scientific and technical knowledge that history had completely failed to recognize until now. When Mount Vernon officially announced the discovery in April 2024, the public response was overwhelming. Within 24 hours, every major news outlet in America covered the story. International media from BBC to Al Jazeera ran features. Social media platforms exploded with discussions, images, and debates. Scientists from dozens of universities immediately requested access. Botanists wanted the seeds. Chemists wanted to analyze preservation liquids. Food historians wanted to understand techniques. Archaeological programs wanted to feature the discovery in teaching. Public reaction was equally intense. Mount Vernon's visitor numbers jumped over 60% in the weeks following announcement. People who'd toured the estate years earlier came back, wanting to see it with completely fresh perspective. The staff quickly developed new exhibits featuring high-resolution imaging of the bottles. They created interactive displays explaining preservation techniques. They developed educational programs for schools using the discovery to teach food science, history, and archaeology simultaneously. But the scientific significance goes way beyond public fascination. These bottles are the only known examples of perfectly preserved 18th century American food in existence anywhere. Not recreations, not approximations. The actual fruits that people in colonial Virginia grew, picked, and preserved. The DNA testing is already revealing extraordinary results. Preliminary analysis suggests the cherries might come from varieties that don't exist anywhere in modern commercial cultivation. The berries show genetic markers consistent with heirloom strains that were common in the 18th century gardens but have completely disappeared from modern agriculture. If those 250-year-old seeds can germinate, which early testing suggests might actually be possible, orchards could grow fruit that nobody alive has ever tasted. Think about that. Cherries that George Washington ate. Berry varieties that Thomas Jefferson wrote about, but that have been extinct for generations. That's not science fiction anymore. The discovery also shattered assumptions that had stood for decades. If Mount Vernon, one of the most exhaustively studied historic sites in America, could still hide something this extraordinary, what else is waiting beneath other estates? What other forgotten chambers exist under historic homes across the country? several major historic properties have already launched new archaeological surveys directly inspired by Mount Vernon's find. They're combining old architectural records with modern ground-penetrating radar, looking for spaces that don't appear in historical documents. Early results from estates in Maryland, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania suggest there might be more hidden chambers waiting to be discovered. Mount Vernon's lead archaeologist pointed out in interviews that none of this would have been possible without the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, those women who saved the estate in 1858, who preserved it through wars and economic collapse, who insisted on meticulous documentation. They made this discovery possible 166 years later. Their vision ensured that when workers lifted those basement floors in 2024, something extraordinary was still waiting. But perhaps the most important impact of this discovery is how it's changing whose stories get told. For too long, Mount Vernon's narrative focused almost exclusively on George Washington, his architectural vision, his agricultural experiments, his political legacy. The skilled workers who actually operated the estate, who created the food, who developed these incredible techniques, their stories were background noise at best. These bottles are changing that conversation in real time. Visitors now ask different questions. Who picked these cherries? Who developed these preservation methods? What other knowledge did these workers possess that history never recorded? What were their names? What were their lives like beyond forced labor? The discovery has forced a fundamental reckoning with how America tells its founding story. It's not just about famous names anymore. It's about recognizing the hundreds of people whose labor, expertise, and knowledge made those grand estates possible. It's about acknowledging extraordinary skill, even when it was deliberately excluded from written records. Modern historians are working to recover names and stories from fragmentary archives. They're cross-referencing estate records, tax documents, and family correspondence to identify specific individuals who worked in Mount Vernon's kitchens during the 1750s. It's difficult work. Many records were lost or destroyed, but every name recovered represents a small victory against historical erasure. The bottles that sat in darkness for 250 years are now illuminating stories that were hidden just as long. So here's what archaeologists actually found at Mount Vernon. It wasn't just 35 bottles of preserved fruit in a forgotten cellar. It was a message from the 1750s America that waited centuries to be heard. It was proof that even our most studied historic sites still hold secrets, that no matter how many times we think we've examined every corner, documented every artifact, and answered every question, there's always more beneath the surface. It was evidence that history belongs to far more people than the ones whose names fill textbooks. Those bottles are helping scientists understand 18th century agriculture in ways previously impossible. They're revealing food preservation techniques that combine knowledge from 3 continents. They're showing us the cultural blending that created American cuisine from African, European, and indigenous traditions. They're potentially reviving extinct fruit varieties that could grow again after 250 years. Imagine tasting a cherry variety that disappeared before the Civil War. That's not fantasy anymore. They're forcing more honest conversations about who actually built early America. Not just the presidents and politicians we celebrate, but the hundreds of enslaved workers whose expertise, innovation, and knowledge made those grand estates function. Most importantly, they're proving the past never stops revealing its secrets. History isn't finished with us. Every generation discovers something that changes how we understand what came before. That fictional cherry tree from the made-up story, it can't tell us anything because it never existed. It was a fairy tale invented to sell books. But these real cherries, preserved by real people with real expertise, they're finally telling the story that history tried to erase. They're giving voice to the voiceless. They're providing tangible evidence of brilliance that was deliberately ignored for centuries. Mount Vernon's discovery reminds us that history isn't static. It's not just dates and names in dusty textbooks. It's tangible evidence waiting beneath our feet, ready to challenge everything we thought we knew, ready to complicate simple narratives, ready to force us to reckon with uncomfortable truths. The discovery changes how we approach historic sites. It proves that assumption is the enemy of discovery. Just because something hasn't been found doesn't mean it isn't there. Somewhere right now, beneath another historic home, another sealed chamber might be waiting. Another untold story. Another group of forgotten experts whose knowledge deserves recognition. Another cache of artifacts that will rewrite what we thought we knew. These bottles survived the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, 2 world wars, and centuries of change. They endured floods, storms, earthquakes, and the weight of the mansion above them. They protected their secrets through everything. Through neglect, through tourism, through restoration, through countless feet, walking overhead, completely unaware. Now those secrets are being shared, and the story they tell is richer, more complex, and infinitely more human than anyone expected. It's a story about skill, about knowledge passed down through generations, about people who created miracles with their hands and saw none of the credit. That's the real discovery at Mount Vernon. Not just bottles, not just fruit, but humanity, preserved perfectly, waiting for us to finally pay attention.